Hello, everybody. I hope I heard correct that I can talk now.
Yes, right.
Because the voice is a little bit not the best quality. I'm very excited to be here. I can't see the room, but I used to study at UCL, so I'm excited to be back. I am a practitioner, so I would present with probably lots of anecdotes and lots of stories and so on, as opposed to sort of the more thought out, amazing presentations that academics do. I am right now sitting in my living room in Kabul, and I can see a primary school, secondary school, a high school, and the Kabul University. It's the biggest university in Afghanistan, from my living room window. And it pains me that all of them, but the primary school is open for access of girls. And it personally pains me because when I was about 15 years old, when the Taliban took over the country the first time, I was in a similar situation. I was in year 8 of school, and the school doors were closed for me, and I had to escape and spend good part of a decade abroad as a refugee, trying to finish my education. I mean, the good thing is it took me to great places like UCL and other institutions, but that it really created a trauma for me, and I see the same thing, the history repeating itself. But I've been reflecting quite a lot on not only women's access to education, but women's access to a lot of different rights since I started to engage more professionally with the communities, and one thing I've realized that the world in Afghanistan, or the world, is not divided into black and white, where the good people allow girls to go to school and university and the bad people don't allow it. I've been looking at the last 100 years of how women's access to education has been politicized and weaponized, and how their ability to get a certain type of education, formal education, and a certain quality and type of education has become something that is being weaponized against women themselves, to marginalize them, to distance them, to stop them from creating a solid movement, and to keep them in their place. And this has been done not only by the Taliban, which is where we focus quite a lot, but from all sides of the political spectrum of Afghanistan, including the 20 years of international intervention in the country. We always hear quite a lot as Afghans that more than 100 years ago, a benevolent king came and gave us the right to education, and we hear about his wife and the travel to Britain and France and the rest of the world, and coming in and opening a girls' school. But if you look at some of the history of 100 years ago in Afghanistan, you can also see that that was a time when a lot of ideas were not allowed to grow and develop from bottom up. There was a lot of class divisions and a lot of urban-rural divisions, secular and non-secular divisions, the minority majority, those with money and those without. There was a lot of tensions, and within this tension, one of the ways that the royal family decided to gain some traction was by giving the women right to an education, by opening up modern schools. Those schools were quite problematic. I had the honor of meeting women, some of the first few women, and quite a lot of them have passed away now, but some of the women who got an education in those schools, and how they went from being raised in a culture of covering up fully, and to a culture where they had to have certain type of Western clothing to be able to enter school. And to the degree that girls were given tights and leggings to put on by the school in order to enter the school. So those with families that were a little bit on the traditional side, or were always, they found it very hard to enter those institutions. So in this way, in the way history is written about Afghanistan, this is always very much glorified, but I always look at it as an era where the distances were created that continued to widen between rural and urban women, between women who got an education and women who for any reason did not get an education. And that was that's how the beginning of weakening of a women's independent, strong movement was created in Afghanistan. Later on, this continued, and I'm not saying that the access to education was fully fully politicized. I mean, there's a lot of women came out of that era of access to education as doctors and as educators, as many good things, and universities starting to emerge, and women started to attend those, and it led to an era where in the Soviet-led Afghanistan, we had, again, quite a lot of women accessing education, urban women accessing education, and a very small number of rural women moving to cities like Kabul or to Herat and Kandahar and so on to access education as the mindset changed a little bit. But there was never an attempt to try and gradually bring access to or create debate around women's own agency to access education. And it was really interesting that as the Soviet era government was the way they were interacting with women, there was a lot of scholarships for women to go out, and very ideological. They came back very ideologically strong, and that was very interesting as well to me. During civil war in Afghanistan and during the Soviet era in Afghanistan, again there was a lot of push. I mean, from the radicals towards, well, I mean, both sides pushed each other, and there was a lot of violence. But the violence was always towards Afghan women. There were lots of acid attacks. There was lots of kidnappings, forced marriages of girls and women who especially accessed higher education. There's a story that my mother told me when I was very young, actually. She told me that because there were 5 sisters, and 5 sisters went to university and school, and the Mujahideen of that time, those that later on took power before the Taliban did, and those were a holy war funded by the Western governments against the Soviet regime. They actually came to my mother's home, and they had to escape in the basement, and then later on they found out that a lot of their classmates were a lot of people at their universities were actually taken over that week, and they were never found. There was also violence against men in these universities and these institutions. But one thing that always surprises me is that how within these institutions there's a lot of political spaces were created for men to act and to gather together, but very little was created for women. Maybe if they were smaller in numbers, they got sometimes absorbed in these mainstream political spaces, but a feminist movement did not emerge to a strong degree. There are some movements that came out. There was the Revolutionary Association of Women of Afghanistan, for example. However, they never became all-encompassing. They never became something that I could, or my contemporaries could become part of. They became they were very functioning in a very limited space. Later on, during Civil War, education was completely inaccessible for Afghan women, and we don't really talk about those years in Afghanistan, sort of late 80s, early 90s. But then we do talk quite a lot about the Taliban era, the first Taliban era, where there's some issues that really stands out for me. There's, of course, the Taliban closing girls' schools and universities. I remember when they took over my city, I was in grade 8, and my chemistry teacher, it was a chemistry lesson, came to talk to my classmate who was her sister, and she asked us to leave and go home. And as we were running home, we saw the opposition of the Taliban, who were sort of running away from the city, and they had realized they'd lost the battle, picking up girls just pushing them into their vehicles and taking them. We were the last of the war bounty that they were picking up from the streets. I was lucky because I'm a very small person. I'm not even 5 foot tall, and I always came across as a child rather than a young woman. And I remember just pressing against the wall and watching this girl who was pulled into a jeep. But then how the world reacted to that was also very. It was mind blowing for me as a 15, 14-year-old. I looked at the United Nations take principled action, and we're talking about principled action again. They got out of Afghanistan. And I remember going to Pakistan and knocking at the door of UNICEF and asking them that why had they abandoned us, and why were they not supporting homeschools? Why were they not supporting movements of youth that was created that I was part of? And why weren't they doing anything? They handed me $500 that they collected from the colleagues there, and they asked me to go and do something myself. So their principled action was to leave us alone and go to the neighboring country while maintaining a high level of overheads and so on. There was also a kind of a dismissal of all these Afghan women that educated a generation. There was 6-7 years that the Taliban were there, and it was the Afghan women and teenagers, myself included, with only 8 years of formal education. We taught kids, and it's estimated that about 25,000 children went to homeschools, and they managed to enter the formal education at the right with the right type of knowledge in their minds. However, that was never consolidated. That was never that group of women were never consolidated. They were never brought together. They were never sort of seen as active, as a homegrown active movement. What happened to them was that later on, when the war on terror happened, or when an invasion was justified based on women's access to education and girls' access to education very, very openly, these women who educated Afghan children were absorbed in the international aid industry. And I naively went back to Afghanistan at that time when the Taliban collapsed, and I had gained my education in the UK. And I felt that I could go back into a system where we're going to create the mindsets and the forces that would never allow us to go back to the Taliban era. But here I am sitting nearly 40 years old, and it's the same situation. Now, what did we get wrong in the last 20 years? I'm just aware of time. I didn't really look. So what did we get wrong? One of the things we got wrong in the last 20 years is that we did not invest in the right type of education for Afghan women. And we also did not empower Afghan women, and we divided Afghan women. The international aid community would send Afghan women to get scholarships. There are lots of Chevening scholarships and Fulbrights. Turkey took hundreds of women. There were positive discrimination at universities. There was one Afghan university that first time in history in Herat had more female students than male, and that was an achievement. We had more girls' education at the primary level, but we still struggled quite a lot. And the reason why I think was that we struggled is because we still maintained that 100-year-old idea that those that get an education somehow were superior and part of the solution of the problem. And those that never managed to get an education, those that lived in rural areas, those that did not proactively seek a formal education, were somehow the beneficiaries of our services, rather than our sisters that we had to collaborate with, that we had to see as people bring skills and so on. And we could, that way we could talk to each other, create groups, have sort of create what I always craved, which was a kind of a women's movement in Afghanistan. And then when you frame everything as beneficiaries and as actors who benefit those beneficiaries, that division really hit us in the last year and a half, when those that were empowered within education, those that were given jobs that went with that education, and they were distanced and placed in opposition to those that, let's say, supported the Taliban or ideologically were different or lived in the rural areas. Those were then put on planes and they were taken out of the country. There was a mass evacuation of educated Afghans. And the reason why they could cut off from the society was because for the 20 years they were isolated. They were made to live in bubbles, and they were not enabled to penetrate the rural, the uneducated, typically, and then therefore it was easier to move. They were turned into bureaucrats rather than feminists, rather than activists, and so on. And now we're back in a state where the Taliban came in, and I don't think they were expecting us to give up so easily. They came and they allowed universities to remain open until about a month ago. Girls negotiated their access to education, but there was a very, very small push internally, and that was really hard from where I'm sitting. A lot of resources and opportunities were shifted to women who are abroad. It almost feels like Afghan women are expected to fight the Taliban through Twitter, through hashtags, and then from outside, whereas women that are inside the country are somehow supposed to wait for something to drastically change. And the viewpoint needs to change. We are not looking for other women in other countries to get something from outside. We got something from outside last time, back in early 2000s, which was the international intervention. That didn't work. So what we need to do this time round is to see how can we support the now consolidating women's movement in Afghanistan. We need to see how can we get girls to get an education online. How can we support women who work at the very subnational level, at the district level, at the village level, at the provincial level, to negotiate with the Taliban around access, because we cannot change a so-called government that have the access to some of the world's most advanced weapons, who are ideologically very united. We cannot change them overnight. We cannot. Sanctions haven't worked against them. But what has worked inside the country is this gradual, constant negotiation and conversation, and that is something we need to look at. We also need to make sure that when we talk about principled action from international organizations, that it doesn't mean abandonment of Afghan people, that there is instead support for Afghan women in creative ways that go beyond the bureaucracies of international organizations. We need to talk about some of the real issues, especially I want to address Muslim women in the West and beyond, and ulama from the Islamic world. We need to talk about some tough issues. Access to education has always not been about access to education in Afghanistan. It has always been about women's hijab and women's presence in the public sphere, and in what way women could present in public sphere. However, 99% of conversations about Afghan women's right to education outside of Afghanistan is about the simple right to access education. We don't talk about, as Muslims or in the wider Islamic communities, we don't talk about hijab. We don't talk about the effects of promotion of certain type of full face coverage of hijab in Western countries from very radical Islamists, on the impact that has on places like Afghanistan when those become the laws that we have to follow here. And it becomes a conditionality to us accessing our basic rights. I think I've spoken a lot. I don't see anybody telling me to stop, but I will stop here. I can talk all the time about this, but thank you very much.